Hey everyone, and welcome back to class. This week we're talking about arguments for and against the existence of God. So we're moving on out of ethics and into metaphysics, where metaphysics is about what stuff exists, basically. So whether or not God exists is a metaphysics question. Whether or not numbers exist, like independent of our minds, what numbers are, philosophy of math type stuff, that's metaphysics. And then questions about what things that exist are like, in the sense of, like, is the mind a physical thing? Is it just your brain? Or is the mind separate? Is there like a soul that's not part of your physical body but still exists? That's a metaphysics question that we'll talk about later. What exactly a person is, like, is a person a mind or is a person the physical body? That's a metaphysics question that we'll talk about. And the questions are often going to be trickier and harder to answer than they seem at first. So today we're talking about God. So the plan for this video is going to be to just cover two arguments for God's existence, arguments that we should believe God exists. And then in the next video, we'll talk about arguments against the existence of God, arguments that try to argue we should not believe God exists. So the two arguments we're going to talk about in this video are Pascal's wager and the ontological argument. So, brief background. The arguments we're going to look at today, both for and against, or the arguments we're going to look at today for the existence of God, are going to try to show that there must be a God, or that we should believe in God. And it's important to note that both in the arguments for the existence of God and the arguments against the existence of God, the notion of God assumed here, the idea of what it would mean for there to be a God, all kind of assume a monotheistic God in line with the Abrahamic religion's conception of God as an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being. So God can't be immoral the way that some of the gods, like in Greek mythology, might have been. God can't be ignorant of anything. God has to be all-knowing or omniscient, has to be all-powerful or omnipotent. God has to be able to do and know everything, anything and everything. That's the idea of God, sort of the concept of a God that is being assumed in these arguments. So the arguments view God as being, by definition, perfect. God is a perfect being. If God is flawed, then it is not a God. If something is flawed, it can't be God. So the perfect being, especially in the second argument we look at today, or in this video, is taken to be the greatest conceivable being and to be necessarily existing, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about what greatest conceivable being means a bit later in the video. The arguments mostly come from philosophers in the Abrahamic religions. So Islamic philosophers, especially from the Islamic Golden Age around like 1000, 1200 AD. Christian philosophers from around the year 1000, like Thomas Aquinas and St. Anselm. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides. Like those are sort of the main historic figures that these arguments come from. And so that's the notion of God assumed in these arguments. So I just want you to have the right picture in mind. Like, these arguments, both the arguments for God and the arguments against God, aren't really going to apply to like Hindu gods or Greek mythology or like bodhisattvas or anything like that. Like, none of that is really on the table or being argued for or against in these arguments. There are arguments that have been considered in those sorts of settings, on those sorts of pictures of what a god or gods could be. But that's not what we're looking at today in these arguments. So, first argument is Pascal's wager. And the important thing to note, first and foremost, right off the bat about Pascal's wager, is that I a little bit lied when I said we were talking about arguments for the existence of God in this video, because Pascal's wager is not exactly an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument that you ought to believe in God. It's an argument that you should believe God exists. But the argument's not really about whether or not God actually exists. The argument is about what it's in your best interest to believe. So the end result of the argument might be more or less the same. The argument saying you should believe in God, and that's what arguments are for, to get you to believe the conclusion. But Pascal's wager doesn't directly argue that God exists. It instead tries to argue that it's in your best interest to believe in God. And so for that reason, you should believe in God. So it assumes that there are two options. Either God exists or God does not exist. And it assumes that either you believe that God exists or you don't believe that God exists. And so this is a big assumption that like there's only one potential picture of God that's on the table, and that's going to form the basis of one of the objections. But that, I mean, if you are considering like two options, and those options are like sort of monotheistic religion or atheism, then Pascal's wager might be relevant to you. That's sort of the pair of choices that Pascal's wager is meant to sort of help you decide between. And so Pascal's wager goes something like this. Either God exists or God doesn't exist, right? One of those two has to be true. Either it's true that God exists or it's true that God doesn't exist. And either you believe in God or you don't believe in God. Like those are the two options for what you believe. Those are the two choices you have. You don't get to choose whether or not God exists, but you get to choose whether or not you believe in God. And so Pascal says we can't rule out the possibility that God exists. We can't prove, like with mathematical certainty. Pascal, this is Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician, so he's worried about mathematics and things like that. So we can't prove with anything like mathematical certainty that God doesn't exist. So even if you think it's really, really unlikely that God exists, even if you think God really probably doesn't exist, you can't say there's absolutely zero chance that God exists. You can't say there's zero possibility. So, no matter how confident you are, we should all agree that there is a chance that God exists. And he thinks we should all agree that there's a chance God doesn't exist. We can't prove with mathematical certainty that God does exist either. So we should all agree, we should all assume there is a chance that God exists and there is a chance that God doesn't exist. So suppose God exists. We've said there's a chance it might be true. Let's suppose God exists. Then if you believe in God, you go to heaven. You get to spend eternity in an infinitely good, infinitely wonderful place for infinite time, which means you get an infinitely good reward for believing in God. For believing in God and sort of living the sort of religious, believe in God kind of life, you get to go to heaven. But if you don't believe in God, and remember, we're supposing that God exists right now, for the sake of argument, we're supposing God exists. If God exists and you don't believe in God, then you go to hell. You spend eternity in an infinitely bad place, being tortured with fire and brimstone and all that. So you get an infinitely bad punishment. You get an infinitely bad result. It's pain for an infinite amount of time. It's torture for eternity. So the punishment for not believing in God, assuming God exists, is infinitely bad. And the reward for believing in God, assuming God exists, is infinitely good. So if God exists, right, on the assumption, the hypothetical assumption that God exists, then the stakes for belief are infinitely high. The reward for believing in God is infinitely good, and the punishment for not believing is infinitely bad. So if God exists, then the rewards and punishments on the table are infinite. It's infinite reward for believing in God, infinite punishment for not believing in God. So that's assuming God exists. Now, let's suppose God doesn't exist. We said there were two possibilities, and they're both possible. We can't rule either of them out. So suppose God doesn't exist. Then whether or not you believe in God, Pascal thinks, is really no big deal. Maybe you'll be a little happier if you believe in God. Maybe you'll be a little happier if you don't believe in God. But the stakes are finite. It's pretty minor. Whether you spend your weekends listening to sermons or watching Netflix and sleeping in on the Sabbath or whatever you do, whether you believe in God or not believe in God, however you spend your time, whatever difference that makes to how you spend your time, it doesn't make an infinite difference. It's not as big a deal as heaven or hell. It's sort of minor differences. It's minor changes in your sort of quality of life. So you might get some minor benefit or some minor harm from believing in God, or some benefit or some harm from not believing in God. But whatever that minor benefit or harm is, that net change in your quality of life, it's going to be finite. It's going to be pretty limited, Pascal thinks. So, therefore, given that we can't rule out God's existence, Pascal says it is better to believe in God than not to believe in God. Because if you believe in God, then you might get infinite reward. Because if you believe in God, then God might exist, in which case you'll get infinite reward. And if you believe in God, you have no risk of infinite punishment. So if you believe in God and you're right, then you get infinite reward. But if you believe in God and you're wrong, all right, no big deal. There's no infinite punishment for believing in God and God not existing. So belief in God brings with it the possibility of infinite reward and no risk of infinite punishment. You get infinite reward for being right and nothing, no big deal if you're wrong. But if you don't believe in God, then if you're right, it's no big deal. If you're right, if you don't believe in God and you're right that there's no God, well, no big deal. You don't really get anything for it. But if you're wrong, if you don't believe in God and God does exist, then you get infinite punishment. Then you go to hell and you're tortured for all eternity. And that's so much worse as an option, Pascal thinks. So if you don't believe in God, then you have the risk of infinite punishment, but no chance of infinite reward. So he thinks believing in God is way better than not believing in God. Believing in God, if you're right, you go to heaven, and if you're wrong, it's no big deal. That's a pretty sweet deal. But if you don't believe in God, then if you're right, it's no big deal. And if you're wrong, you go to hell. That's a terrible option. Those are terrible outcomes. So therefore, believing in God is just a way better option for you, given the odds, given the chances of God existing or God not existing. Given that there's a chance either way, it's way safer to believe in God than not to believe in God. So, for purely self-interested reasons, you should believe in God. And that's Pascal's wager. It's like, look, if God exists, then it's way better to believe in God than not believe in God. And if God doesn't exist, it really doesn't matter what you do. So why not believe in God? Why not rule out hell as a future outcome and gain the possibility of heaven? Why would you choose not to believe in God, thereby risking eternity in hell and ruling out any possibility of heaven? Why would you do that? Pascal thinks you shouldn't. You should believe in God for your own self-interest. Now, that has led to some objections. Pascal made this argument in the 1600s, I believe, and not everyone has thought that the argument is good. Some people have objected to the argument. So one objection to the argument has been that if you believe in God for purely self-interested reasons, just because it's a safe bet for selfish goals, that's not going to get you into heaven. That's not worthy of divine reward. That's an insincere belief where you're playing the odds, and no God worthy of the name would allow that or would reward that with heaven. So this isn't actually any belief you have as a result of this argument is not going to get you into heaven, and so the argument's not really going to work. Because if the argument convinces you to believe in God, then you won't end up getting into heaven, even if there is a God, because you were insincere and selfish about it, and no God would reward that. Now, Pascal's response to this, because this objection was made almost immediately, so Pascal had time to respond to it in his lifetime. Pascal's response was that even if you start trying to believe in God for purely selfish reasons, for purely self-interested, insincere, I want to get what's mine, the hell with everything else type reasons, by choosing to believe in God, you will be setting yourself down a path that will eventually lead you to have sincere religious experiences and sincere religious beliefs that are worthy of divine reward. By choosing to believe in God and to live the life of someone who believes in God, going to church and all that stuff. Pascal was Catholic, so this is sort of his background picture of it. You will end up becoming worthy of divine reward. You will end up having a sincere, genuine belief worthy of divine reward. So the argument will still go through. That's Pascal's response. Now, maybe you think that works. Maybe you think it doesn't. That's fine. Another objection. We can't rule out other gods or godlike beings either. So Pascal's wager says we can't prove with mathematical certainty that God doesn't exist. And we can't prove with mathematical certainty that God does exist. So we can't rule it out. So we have to consider both options. That's what Pascal thinks. But Pascal only considered one God. But there are lots of gods that we can't rule out. All you have to do is think and imagine hypothetically. And you'll come up with an image of God, a conception of some God or godlike being that might exist, that you can't prove doesn't exist. And that's a problem for his view, because it's not just the gods of all the religions that actually existed, right? Like Pascal is probably going to have to say, we can't prove that sort of the Abrahamic monotheistic God doesn't exist. But we also can't prove that like Zeus and Athena and the Greek mythology gods don't exist. You can't prove with sort of mathematical certainty that they don't exist. Similarly for Hindu gods, Buddhist bodhisattvas, which are not gods, but probably close enough for the argument or for the objection to the argument. Zoroastrian gods, like pick a religion, Xenu from Scientology, pick a religion. We can't prove that those gods don't exist. So by Pascal's reasoning, we have to consider that possibility. And we don't just have to consider the gods of religions that actually existed. We can't prove that the gods that religions have thought of so far are the only ones on the table. We can come up with other hypothetical gods that no one has ever believed in, but still we can't prove don't exist. If any other gods besides the sort of Catholic version of God that Pascal has in mind, if any of those other gods exist, then believing in the wrong God might be just as bad as believing in no God at all. If you believe in the wrong God, you might still end up being punished for all eternity. So then, it looks like no matter what you choose to believe or not believe, you always have a risk of divine retribution. You always have a risk of infinite punishment. And there could even be, hypothetically, a God that wants us not to believe in them. There could be a God that wants us not to believe in any gods. That seems implausible. That's probably not true, sure. But we can't prove that there's no God who wants us not to believe in any gods. So, the objection goes, if there is such a God, if there were such a God, then not believing in gods would get you divine reward. You get to go to heaven because this hypothetical God rewards not believing. And believing in gods in any gods would risk infinite punishment. You might go to hell just for believing in something. By Pascal's reasoning, which is we have to consider all the possibilities that we can't disprove, then it looks like there are infinitely many possible hypothetical gods that we have to consider. And no matter what you end up believing, you will always have a risk of infinite reward and a chance at infinite, or a risk of infinite punishment and a chance at infinite reward. You'll always have the chance of either, because some hypothetical God that you can't rule out with 100% certainty will punish you for one thing that another God would reward you for it. So no matter what, you always have a chance of divine reward and a chance of divine punishment. So the objection goes, Pascal's reasoning can't give you any reason to believe anything. No matter what you choose to believe or not believe, you always have a chance of divine reward and you always have a chance of divine punishment. So there's no safe choice. Pascal's whole argument is based on the assumption that believing in God has a chance of divine reward and no chance of divine punishment. But this objection says, look, of all the infinitely many possible gods that we can't rule out, no belief type decisions we make will give us 100% certainty that we have a chance at divine reward and no chance at divine punishment. There's always going to be a chance that we get infinite punishment for what we do or don't believe. And there's always going to be a chance that we get infinite reward for what we do or don't believe. So you might as well, of all the options on the table, you might as well not believe in any particular God, because any one of them could end up existing and punishing you. That's the objection. It can't give us a good reason to believe in any particular God, because no matter what belief we're considering, there are possible gods that will reward us for it, and there are possible gods that will punish us for it. So no matter what we believe, we risk infinite punishment and have a chance at infinite reward. And so the objection is that once we take into account the plurality, the whole collection of possible gods that we can't rule out, once we take all of them into account, the wager gives us no incentive to believe or not believe any particular thing. That's the objection. And Pascal did not respond to this objection because it didn't come around until after Pascal died. So we don't know what Pascal would say to this. Maybe you think this objection works. Maybe you think it doesn't. I encourage you to think about it, because this is an interesting question, I think. And if it turns out that the objection's wrong and Pascal's wager is right, then you have an incentive there. But if the objection turns out right, then you can just live your life however you were going to live it anyway and ignore Pascal's argument. Now, that's one argument. That was Pascal's wager. Now we're going to talk about the ontological argument. And this is the one from the reading. This is the one from Descartes' Meditations. So multiple versions of the ontological argument have been raised over the years. Anselm, Aquinas, Descartes. But the version we're going to look at comes from Descartes. And so this is the version that Descartes talks about in the reading, in the Meditations. So the ontological argument attempts to show that we can prove that God exists simply from the definition of God. It follows, logically, from the definition of God alone, that God must exist. So Pascal's wager only tried to argue that you should believe in God because it's in your best interest. But the ontological argument actually tries to argue that God exists. It argues for the claim that God exists. It doesn't tell you that it would be in your best interest to believe it. It tells you it's true, or that's what the argument tries to tell you. So here's the argument. I'm just going to spell it out in sort of numbered premise conclusion form. So Descartes says, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being. God is a perfect being, and God is the greatest conceivable being. Which means that God is a being such that no greater being can be conceived. Right? So Descartes thinks that we can conceive of God because we talk about God. Whether or not you believe in God, you can conceive of God. Like, you understand what it means when someone says they do or don't believe in God, they have a conception of what God is that they do or don't believe in. So Descartes thinks we can conceive of God. And he thinks we can't conceive of anything better than God, right? Because God is perfect. God is supposed to be this infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being. So we can't conceive of something better than God, because God's perfect. So we can't conceive of something better than God. God is a being such that no greater meaning better here, no greater being can be conceived. That's premise one. God is the greatest conceivable being. We cannot conceive of anything greater than God. So premise two is that a being that exists is greater than a being that does not. Right? So something that exists is better than something that doesn't exist. Right? It's better to have a car that exists than to have a car that doesn't exist. Like, a real car is better than an imaginary car. Real dessert is better than the idea of a dessert. Like, something that exists is better than something that doesn't. A being that exists is greater than one that doesn't exist. That's premise two. So premise three here is that if God does not exist, so hypothetically, suppose God doesn't exist, well, then we can conceive of a being greater than God, a being better than God. All we have to do is imagine a being that's exactly like God, except that it exists. Right? So imagine God, but existing. We said something that exists is better than something that doesn't. So this being that we've conceived of, that's just like God, except that it exists, must be better than God, must be greater than God. But by premise one, God is the greatest conceivable being. We can't conceive of anything greater than God. So if God doesn't exist, then we can conceive of a being greater than God. But we can't conceive of a being greater than God. That's from premise one. So, therefore, God does exist. Because if he didn't exist, then we could conceive of a being greater than God. But by definition of God, we can't do that. So, we can't conceive of a being greater than God. So, God must exist. Because otherwise, we get a contradiction. We both can and can't conceive of something better than God. So, God does exist. And so as written, this argument is valid. So the question is the argument sound? Are all of the premises true? And that's what objections to the argument historically have focused on. So one objection, I call it the conceivability argument here, which some people have called it, but it's the ontological argument, really. But some people call it the conceivability argument because it's about God being conceivable. So one objection is just that God isn't conceivable. So one objection is just that we really can't conceive of God. God is an infinite, all-powerful being, and we have finite, limited minds. So we can't conceive of something that great. So we can't conceive of God in the first place. So if we can't conceive of God in the first place, then the argument doesn't go through because premise one is false. God isn't the greatest conceivable being because God just isn't a conceivable being. So that's one objection to the argument. Another objection is that the argument proves too much. So it looks like you can run this same argument to prove the existence of lots of things that don't exist, right? So there's a monk from 1500s, maybe 1400s, something like that, who parodies this argument. And it's called the perfect island argument. And it's a parody. You know, like Weird Al Yankovic does parodies of songs where he takes the same melody and puts different words in. This is a parody. It takes the same logical structure and puts different words in. And it's meant to show that there's something wrong with this argument. So here's the perfect island argument. The perfect island is the greatest conceivable island. An island such that no greater island can be conceived. Premise two, an island that exists is greater than an island that does not. Premise three, if the perfect island does not exist, then we can conceive of a greater island, one just like the perfect island in every way, except that it exists. So this is just like the ontological arguments for God so far. If the perfect island doesn't exist, well, we said islands that exist are greater than ones that don't. So if the perfect island doesn't exist, we can conceive of a greater island, one just like it, but that it exists. But the perfect island is the greatest conceivable island, so we can't conceive of a greater island. That's premise four. We cannot conceive of a greater island. So therefore, the perfect island does exist. Right? So this is just like the ontological argument for God's existence. It just replaces the word God with the perfect island and replaces the word being with island. So Gonilo, or however you pronounce the old-timey monk's name, is trying to show that there's something wrong with the argument. So he's not trying to say which premise is false, but he's trying to say, look, this kind of argument clearly has a flaw because it's insane to think that the perfect island exists. Of course, the perfect island doesn't exist. No island is perfect. That's not a thing. So the perfect island doesn't exist. So he says, there must be a flaw in this argument, this perfect island argument, because the conclusion is false. And so whatever flaw exists in this argument must exist in the original argument too. Whichever of these premises is false for islands will also be false for beings. And so the ontological argument must fail. This doesn't show where the argument fails, but the objection's supposed to show that it must fail somewhere. Now, maybe you think the objection doesn't work. Maybe you think the issue is the word island. Or maybe you think the perfect island does exist. There are different ways you could try to respond to this objection. And some people have defended the argument against the objection in the history of philosophy. All right, so that's just a couple of objections to the ontological argument. All right, so those are the two arguments for the existence of God. Pascal's wager tries to say it's in your best interest to believe in God, and the ontological argument tries to say that God exists. And there are some objections to both, but both arguments still have their defenders, and there are replies to the objections and things. So it's not a settled issue in philosophy yet. So I'm going to leave it here. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video where we will talk about arguments against the existence of God.